This podcast is coming to you from Wongal and Gadigal country, also known as Balmain, where the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is located. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we share and agree that sovereignty was never ceded. So welcome to another episode of A Just a Generation. I have on the program the Right Reverend or Padre James Bhagwan, Secretary General of the Pacific Conference of Churches, who is here at the moment in Australia to deliver the Apeli Hawafa lecture. Welcome to the program, James.
Thank you, Alopi. It's great to be with you.
Your journey to social justice is an interesting one. Can you tell us about your family, your own journey, and what led you to now taking on a further extension as Secretary General for PCC at this point in time?
Very interesting. So I am a third generation Fiji Islander of Indian origin, or Fijian of Indian origin. My father's family came from were brought really from India by the British in their first iteration of modern slavery that was known as the indenture system. And my mother's family was as well. I come from a parent whose father converted from Hinduism to Christianity, and a mother who converted from Islam to Christianity. And both of my parents, as strong Christians, believed very much in that faith should be lived in community, faith in action. And so I was raised in not only a strong Christian family, but in a family that believed in putting faith into action. And so from a very early age, I was exposed to this through the various community programs and activities our parents were involved in. And, being the youngest in the family, sometimes I was dragged along to some of these meetings, either with my mother or with my father. And so I grew up having that understanding that faith, while personal, is also public. It is, as a Methodist, coming from a Methodist family and a Methodist orientation of Christianity, our understanding of Christianity is not just it's a personal faith, but it's got to be lived out in social. It's a social religion. And that really was part of my upbringing. And then, going through a certain journey of as a young person, in a country where the Methodist churches has both positive and negative impacts in society at a time where we had military coups, etc. Going through my own personal journey of faith, seeking and trying to understand faith and spirituality, and coming full circle actually and recognizing that the faith community I was in was for me the best expression of my spirituality and my Christian faith. I've served as circuit or parish minister. I've taught at our local theological college, and my last appointment in the church was as secretary for communication and overseas mission. So I've been fortunate to have a good rounding of experience in a denomination, in a church, from local community work to education to national level engagement. And in 2008, after finishing my term as Secretary for Communication, the Methodist Church nominated me to be General Secretary of PCC. I was elected, and just at our last General Assembly, which took place last November, I was re-elected unopposed. And so I guess it's either it's a affirmation of the work done, or the fact that nobody wants the job, but I'll take the former. And so I have this term to serve as General Secretary before returning back to serve in my home church.
Just on that, I guess in such a senior role as Secretary General, do you bring elements of your experience and pastoral work from ministry into the work as, I guess as a recognized face for the churches in the Pacific to the work, or do you see it as very separate separate responsibilities and separate roles?
No, in fact, I can only work from what I know and what I've experienced. My formal education, I guess you could say, has been specifically in theology. I did a Bachelor of Divinity in Ecumenical Studies at the Pacific Theological College, Masters in the Methodist University in Seoul, South Korea, in Christian social ethics. But that's it. The experience I've had in leadership has been through managing a team at the Methodist Church head office, or in the work that I've done previously in the media and stage managing concerts and things like that. And so I understand teamwork. I understand how you need to motivate teams to deliver, particularly creative teams. And so I understand working with different types of personalities. But I only know how to, and the leadership that I've been exposed to has always been one of servant leadership. And so I bring with me that, that understanding that I approach this work, yes, as a Secretary General, but as a pastor, first and foremost. That is who I am, or as a human being. And so we try, there's often the cliche where someone says, we're not a team, we're a family. And I heard somebody recently say, if you hear that, get away from that organization straight away. But we really do. We try and work as a family of God. And I think that's, for us, working in a Christian organization is something that's important. We work as a community, and in a faith tradition that understands what working in community means. And so, we bring that pastoral element, we bring that Pacific element of community, and we work as a family or community as much as we can, and just as a team when we have to, when we really got to knuckle down and get things done. Yeah.
It strikes me that there are so many levels of responsibility you have, and I'm always amazed by how people can strike that work-life balance, particularly given your responsibilities in the public domain as a leader, pastor, minister, and the many other roles you juggle. And then also being able to fulfill, obviously, your family responsibilities. And it'd be interesting to hear from you on how you personally strike that work-life balance, and whether you feel you've got it right at this point, or whether maybe there's lessons learned.
Very much so. Very much so. I am first and foremost always extremely grateful to my wife Maylin and to my children as well, Francisco and Antonia. They have sacrificed a lot. Working in the ministry is a demanding role. You work, you serve, you deal with so many issues from a pastoral perspective, particularly in developing countries, where you cannot really separate the spiritual from the issues, from the socioeconomic justice issues, and the different ways they manifest in communities. And then when you finish all that, you need a break. You need to debrief, you deprogram yourself before you can go into your family, because you're carrying a lot of things that you can't share because of pastoral confidentiality. And then you come home and you spend time, and sometimes it's late. I lived in Korea by myself for 2 years. So the family, Maylin was raising the kids with my mother and the support of the family. So it's been a challenge. The first year, in fact, the night of the election for General Secretary in 2018, the outgoing General Secretary, Reverend Francois Pihatai from Mauhinui, came up to me and said, make sure you're ready and make sure your family's ready, because you will be on the road for 9 months of the year. And he was serious. And the election was actually underway, and I was texting my wife to say, look, please, I need this confirmation from you, whether you feel this is okay, because I will be away for 9 months of the year. And she said, no, we've done it before. We'll manage, and this is God's call. And so I'm very grateful for that support that I have, and the love from the kids who are very understanding and recognize. And are not don't bear any grudges to me or to the church or PCC. And for the first year, 2019, that's what it was. It was crazy. And then we got hit by COVID. And so that was, a welcome respite to spend time at home, even though it meant late night Zooms to do our work that we do in Europe and other places. But I've been very fortunate. I have my outlets, swimming, stand up paddling, etc. 6 years later now, I'm slowly getting the balance right. I've committed to this term being one where I manage my well-being and not just my well-being, but the well-being of our team at PCC is very important. So we do take time for self-care, team bonding, spending time together. And I think that's also very, very important, not just for ourselves, but the energy we create in the workspace as well.
Now, having worked for a minister in the political sense, I can see the actual the same or very similar areas of pressure and the need to strike balance. And often there's so much sacrifice that people give in taking up roles where they are, forward facing. They're the public face of things, and often are they're seen as a person who represents many, many different points of view and many, many different perspectives. And so to take all that on is, well, I tip my hat off to you, James. Last night you spoke about the role of faith institutions and people advocating for social, climate, economic and development justice and outcomes in the region. If you had to prioritize them, what are the most significant issues facing the Pacific at the moment?
If you ask me from public engagement space in terms of advocacy, climate change is the key thing on the mind of all Pacific people. But if you ask me from a faith perspective, I would say one of the biggest challenge we face is I see that one of the challenges we have faced, particularly within the mainline faith communities, is that we are at a place where religiosity has taken the lead instead of spirituality. I was really heartened by a recent meeting of senior leaders of the Methodist Church in Fiji, and the address given by the current president of the Methodist Church, Reverend Dr. Semisi Turangavo, was reclaiming the lost image of Christ in the church. And that's an important thing to say because it also speaks about, colonial legacies of mission and the process of decolonization that we still face in the region. So that's on one side, the need for us to reclaim spirituality. And I think that's also affecting a lot of the issues that we face today. Climate change, of course, is a key issue facing everyone around the world. But specifically to the Pacific, we're at the forefront of this very devastating crisis. We are, vulnerable communities, and there is a power in that vulnerability that Archbishop Peter Loy Chong often talks about, the theology of vulnerability. But at the same time, we are people who deal with things because we don't have a lot. Because as developing countries, we just we have a Fijian word of "vosota." We just bear it, and we pick up the pieces, and we continue. And so there is a certain resilience around that, which is this tension that we face between vulnerability and resilience in the face of climate change. But self-determination and decolonization really are at the forefront of many of the issues that we face. There is the political aspect, what's happening in our region with three territories or 4, 5 territories, actually, if you start counting the list of communities who are fighting for self-determination, for the right to determine their own future as people, as a nation. Maui Nui, French Polynesia, Kanaki, New Caledonia. You have Guam, You have West Papua, and you even have places like Bougainville, which have had a referendum for independence from Papua New Guinea, but the process has been stalled by Papua New Guinea. So, I think to sum it all up, the quest for justice is multi-layered, and that is because we are a region that continues to be seen as the final frontier for extraction. And this is something that perhaps we need to, as the church, recognize that in order to care for the souls of people, we've got to care for their physical needs as well, their medical well-being, holistic well-being. Reverend Professor Poluvai from the Pacific Theological College talks about whole of life. And there is a need to address justice and injustice from a whole of life perspective.
Mm. Just on that point, obviously in Australia, we've just gone through a referendum, which was a big disappointment, obviously, for our First Nations community, and devastating, in fact, for many. New Zealand is facing, its own challenges at the moment in terms of them being a benchmark of what can be done in recognition of, First Nations and people with traditions and long histories in the region. It'd be interesting, given you've talked about decolonisation and talked about thinking through some of these issues. How do those communities look to the Pacific for solidarity? How do they think through the way in which they are able to talk about where they're coming from now with a region that has faced a similar history, but at the same time have a very different set of circumstances now, in terms of having their own sovereignty, having in many respects their own self-determination?
Yeah, I think we can see there is a marked difference between those communities that have very large settler communities and where the power is held in those communities. We've seen a change in Kanaki and Mauhinui recently, but up until the last round of elections, where the independence movements representing indigenous communities came into power, the power was always in the hand of the pro-French, parties and groups. In the West Papua is being affected by the transmigrasi. There's waves of thousands and thousands of people from Indonesian, islands and states coming into West Papua and going from being in the majority to being a minority in their own country. And I think part of the issue is that there are times when the indigenous community are the minority or being made the minority through whatever reason. In terms of what the role of the Pacific, the other Pacific islands are, I think the solidarity is very, very important. The struggle for indigenous rights is not new, definitely not new in New Zealand. They've been through this, very difficult time right up until the 90s. And mid to late 90s is where you saw a big shift taking place. And now a lot of that's going backwards. The referendum last year on The Voice was, I think, very disappointed. I think there was almost, I'll be honest, it felt like a setup to fail because everything hinged on the referendum, where there could have been a lot more work done beforehand and in communities. And so perhaps the process was not right. And what that means going forward is going to be very, very difficult. In 2018, when the PCC had its its General Assembly, its 11th General Assembly, it was held in Auckland as recognition of Auckland being the largest Pacific Island city, and to recognize the huge presence of Pacific diaspora in New Zealand and in Australia. And the theme for that assembly was Sing the Lord's Song in a Strange Land. That spoke to the lament of disconnection and alienation. And, it talks about the exile, of course, but that feeling of exile in your own land is an amazing and a terrible thing. And when what PCC does is we take the theme of the assembly and we adapt it into something that fits the work that we have been charged to do as a result of the resolutions from our assembly. And the working frame that we had for the last 5 years was singing the Lord's song in strange lands and strange times, and acknowledging a need to acknowledge that even for indigenous communities, their lands have been made strange. So this applies, of course, to First Nations in Australia and in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the recognition that PCC was then charged with specifically engaging and upholding not just diaspora communities, but First Nations in these two lands as well. And so we worked to bring on board the Maori Council of Churches into our membership, and recognizing that any Australian church's membership in PCC comes first and foremost through the First Nations, its First Nations congregations. And our work within Australia, even in engagement with the Australian government, has always begun with the calling for the inclusion, not just of the voice, but the presence of First Nations and Pacifica diaspora in that space.
Yeah, all this sort of leads me to my next question around, you talked a little bit about the need for a prophetic voice, and prophets in the old days were in fact always speaking truth to power at times of great social change, turmoil, or conflict. How can the churches now take a more prophetic role in social justice? And what does this mean in practical terms in an era of dropping numbers in the church, particularly in places like Australia, and influences like social media and other things that younger generations are turning to and are influenced by?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and this is something that's happening particularly with the Anglo community around the world. You go to the UK, where many of our churches missions come from. We'll be the youngest people there, and I see that happening in many other parts of the world. But there is an increase in non-Anglo communities being members of faith communities and churches. And, we see opportunities where this engagement of the global sister and brotherhood of faith coming together into parishes, which are becoming more and more multicultural, is very important. But we have to remember that the prophets of old, prophets of the Old Testament, etc., and modern-day prophets also, didn't only speak about social justice issues in the society. They addressed the failures of the faith community. Jesus, was very critical of the religious community and the direction in which they were going. And we've seen that the church needs to own up to its mistakes. I've seen that in the Methodist Church and the reconciliation and restoration process that they went through, or we went through in 2014 as part of our Jubilee celebrations, looking for what Jubilee really means is restoration of relationship. And that's very, very important. At the same time, we have to recognize that churches, in a secular sense, are lumped into faith-based organizations or organized religions. But they are faith communities, spiritual communities, which have very human leaders who make very human mistakes and do things. And, how do we then speak internally within the church to address these issues? And, there's been betrayal of trust. There's been many issues. How do we do that within our churches so that we can start to speak out on these issues? Coming from the Pacific, where there's very strong patriarchal culture, which has been brought in or become part of the faith communities in the Pacific. When we began our work on gender justice, on addressing gender-based violence, the first thing I had to do was to acknowledge that for a long time, the church was on the side of the perpetrator. That the church has had to acknowledge the places where they have made mistakes and gone wrong. But as Christians, repentance is part of who we are, that metanoia, that transformation. That yes, we have done this. How do we restore and how do we do better? In terms of the prophetic voice, I think we still have that role because civil society, we have very good activists. We have very strong civil society. And many of, in the Pacific, the majority of civil society are motivated by their Christian faith. And it's not separate. It's just that they work in a secular space or for, civil society organizations, but they're modeled and motivated on the message of Christ, justice, freedom, love, etc. And for us as the church, how do we step back into that space? It's firstly by accompanying and making sure that when we speak, we are really speaking for God and not speaking for ourselves, but we're also speaking for the vulnerable in our community and rebuilding that trust. And I think that's some of the stuff that we've tried to do. And then being very strong on the social justice work. I shared a Bible study at the recent World Council of Churches gathering for some of its commissions, Commission on International Affairs, Commission on Climate Change and Sustainable Development, and Commission for Health and Healing. And I was asked to do a Bible study on the prophetic voice of the church and the prophetic role of our work. And I was reflecting on not just the prophetic voice, the voice of the prophets, but the actions which they did. These prophets were hardcore activists, and they would put some of our, most amazing actions to shame. If you look at the work of Ezekiel, and the stuff they did in the public space, and I think that's where we need to get back out. And it's not about the church taking the lead in this space. It's about the church walking with those who are doing this work. So, for example, when we go to a climate change COP meeting, if there is a march or if there is an action that's being done, most of the time the Pacific Conference of Churches will not be in the faith space because there's enough people there and they're showing, here we are as the faith community doing this work. We're actually with the Pacific Climate Warriors. We're with our Pacific activists, supporting them and letting them know that the church stands with them and, in supporting in that sense. And that's, for me, where we as Pacific churches should be and where the churches could be. I see that happening now, but we really need to maybe pull out some of our stops and not be ashamed to get involved all the way.
There are so many things that I can tease out from just that, and I'm aware that we're coming to the end of the interview, but let's see this as the first of many conversations. James, if there were three pieces of advice, and I ask this of every guest on Adjusted Generation, if there were three pieces of advice you would give your younger self, what would they be?
The first would be just to trust God's process. I was told at a very young age, my mother said to me, we prayed for a son and you were born and we have dedicated you to God. And that was great when I was 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. When I started to hit about 13, I said, oh no, this isn't right. I want to have a life. And I kind of had a Jonah experience, I went full circle. But that full circle was to prepare me for the work and the type of ministry that I do. So trust in God's process is the first. The second is, listen more, talk less. And that's hard to say for someone who's a Gemini and in the communications field before entering the ministry. But listen more, I think that is one. And, perhaps the third is, take time. Not only listen more, but take time and allow the process of discernment and recognizing in God's time, we will be able to do what needs to be done.
James, I think that's a great place to end our interview. Can I say, not only do we have so much in common on so many levels, but you're a Gemini as well. I can't believe it. So
Next thing you'll say you're left-handed. Are you left-handed?
no, I'm right-handed, so
Okay, there we go.
balancing it out. The twins are balancing each other out. Okay, with that, thank you very much for being part of Adjusted Generation, and best of luck with the Apeli Hawafa lecture and everything else this year.
Thanks so much. Bless you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Adjusted Generation. It's through supporters like yourself that we keep our work going. You can support the work of the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education by making a donation through our website, www.erc.org.au. The Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is part of Edmund Rice Community Services. I'm Alopi Latukefu. Until next time, goodbye.